Hello, my name is Aidan Donaghy, and I'm a senior humanitarian studies and anthropology major at Fordham University here in New York City. I've been studying Irish and Irish American affairs for a couple of years now, and as the son of an Irish immigrant, it's a pleasure to be here so that I can share a project about which I care deeply. My senior thesis, titled Understanding Identity Among Minority Language Learners, The Case of Irish in New York, uses historical analysis, participant observation, and ethnographic interviews to begin to understand one element of Irish and Irish American cultural life in New York, which is the preservation of the Irish language. Now, Ireland itself usually receives the most scholarly attention when it comes to examining the Irish language revival movement, and especially the Republic of Ireland. And this makes some sense. Ireland is home to the Gaeltacht, is where Irish is spoken as the daily language, and to the vast majority of the world's Irish speakers. But Ireland also has a long history of emigration, and Irish roots in global immigration strongholds like New York City run very deep. Given that there is a lively and vibrant Irish language scene in the New York area, which I discovered, I decided that this would be the perfect place to learn about the lives and identities of a diasporic minority language community and sort of see what extrapolations we can get from this research. So to that end, I spent 8 weeks attending Zoom-mediated Irish language classes hosted by a local Irish cultural organization. And in that time, I conducted over a dozen interviews with many Irish language learners, including a few seasoned professionals. Um, in fact, the study is ongoing, so in my presentation today, I'll share some of my findings, explain where further research is needed, and along the way sort of attempt to situate my research within some of the larger conversations about Irish as a minority language and transnational, transatlantic identity formation. I won't be able to cover the full findings that I've gathered in this presentation, but I very much welcome any questions or comments you may have later on, and I'm very excited to keep developing research. Now, when I started taking beginner's Irish and began to get to know my classmates, I quickly realized, of course, that this identity formation that I mentioned would look different for each person. Um, Yet, by asking questions about the language, I was able to uncover some shared themes. Um, but first of all, a bit of a background into who is in this class. Everyone in my class, except for one person who I'll talk about later, has some level of Irish ancestry. Several people had been raised by Irish immigrant parents and grandparents in historically Irish neighborhoods. They took Irish step dancing as a child. They sang Irish music. They were altar servers. They attended Irish Catholic churches. Um, Others had been less involved throughout their lives in what you would think of as traditional Irish cultural practices, and very few grew up in households where Irish was the main spoken language. Few Americans grew up in environments where Irish phrases were thrown around from time to time. That was certainly the case in my Irish American household. But for many people, Irish traditional practices weren't necessarily a defining part of growing up. Um, it was interesting to sort of discover this diversity, who have converged into this Irish language community, having such different levels of exposure to some of the other traditionally thought of cultural practices. It's also worth noting that almost everyone in my class, including the instructor, was a woman. The instructor herself was a passionate and well-connected native Irish speaker who moved to New York from the Kerry Gaeltacht, where she was raised. She is a millennial, and her overriding message about the Irish language is that it is not deserving of its stuffy, sort of depressive reputation, which I think is more common in the Republic of Ireland, where it's a compulsory school subject. Uh, but rather, she says, the sort of native language of Ireland is a living, changing, modern language with, rap music being made in Irish. There are Irish language memes. There are jokes. There are curse words. Some pretty funny ones when you directly translate them. So these are the kind of things that she cared about because to her that was how the Irish language will live on. But going back to the issue of gender, I asked her what she thought about the gender disparity that I noticed, and she had noticed it as well. Although I still have yet to come up with like the proper framework for analyzing this, she told me that in her experience, the vast majority of US-based Irish learners she had met have been women, while the majority of US-based proficient Irish speakers seem to be men. So people who have more proficiency in the language. I still don't know entirely what to make of this, and I welcome any questions or comments this because there are so many fascinating ways that gender can be analyzed in terms of minoritized language revival. But as it turns out, actually, the question about identity here is even more complex than just the gendered element. It seems that education and class, and to an extent, whiteness, defined participation in this space. I found that, in fact, I was one of the least formally educated students in my community. And indeed, everyone in our class was white, although I have heard from our instructor that there are many non-white Irish language learners, and I even anecdotally know someone who lives in Ireland who was adopted from Thailand and speaks Irish. So this is by no means an exclusive space, but one that seems to attract a majority of white learners, especially in the US context. But in terms of education, I was fascinated to find that lots of my classmates had advanced degrees. Many of them were scholars of literature and poetry and music. Um, and they have busy, accomplished lives. It was these students, these self-professed scholars, many of them lovers of language who have learned other languages before, who led me to another realization, which is that the disruptions in digitization of social life necessitated by the COVID-19 pandemic actually provided an unexpectedly accessible space for busy people to take on another language project. But this time, it seems that many people have chosen to forego the traditionally thought of as more useful languages like French or Spanish, but rather they have chosen to engage with the Irish language. Many people that I interviewed, it was a fun challenge, something that both connected them to their heritage and also made them feel like they were learning a new secret code that not many people know. Um, which was interesting and fascinating. Um, I also found that the space was liberal, optimistic, and idealistic. I'll be the first to say, in fact, that I have a somewhat romanticized view of Ireland and of the Irish language because I visited Ireland and met my family over there, and I love them, and I love Ireland. And many people have these very personal connections with their long lost Irish heritage. Um, So, although many of my classmates and myself included were intimidated by elements of the Irish language, there was this overriding feeling of I'm learning something that my ancestors weren't allowed to learn, which I thought was so fascinating. People had various levels of political uh, engagement in their personal lives and their knowledge of Irish and American politics. But this was something that stood out as a bit of a theme to people, wanting to be able to connect with this heritage, accompanied with some knowledge that there's a history of oppression there, which is long and a bit dry. So I won't get into it here, but many people also incorporated this idealized notion of Ireland into their Irish language goals. Um, Many people said that they wanted to be able to, go to Ireland, sit down at a pub in the Gaeltacht and strike up a conversation with a local As Gaeilge in Gaelic. And some actually even wanted to achieve such proficiency that they would be able to raise their children speaking Irish fluently. And in fact, next week I'll conduct interviews with two different men who live in the New York City area and are raising their young children bilingually with Irish and English. But for the sake of this presentation, I'll continue. In 2015, language scholars Bernadette O'Rourke and John Walsh published the findings of their own ethnographic study of new Irish speakers in the Republic of Ireland. And they found an interesting point of tension there. In the Irish cultural imagination, they found there is an idealization of what they have defined as the traditional Gaeltacht speaker. Uh, and this idealization can cast a veil over the vast majority of Ireland's Irish speakers who live in non-Gaeltacht regions. I found through my interviews that this idealization, of course, also exists within the American context. Um, and many New York-based Irish language learners in this way seem to be searching for some sort of essence of a pre-colonized Ireland through the language itself. In a space specifically designed for beginners, a world of possibilities is constructed because for people like our instructor, optimism about the language is self-rewarding. If students' Irish language goals are encouraged as valid and realistic and within the context of a truly living, exciting language, the revival movement stands to gain more practitioners and the language thus lives on. While I largely think that O'Rourke and Walsh's claim has a great merit, I found an interesting pattern in my own research. Uh, though idealized and romanticized formalizations of a distant and, dare I say, authentic Irish speaker brush past the vast majority of modern non-Gaeltacht Irish speakers in Ireland, I'll say that for the descendants of Irish immigrants and even for the non-Irish descended Irish learners in New York themselves, this romantic notion has actually pushed them to take on the task of learning this minoritized language. Thus, they occupy an interesting space. They both perpetuate the idealized notion of the Gaeltacht speaker while actively existing as the opposite, still in a way that keeps the Irish language moving, keeps it alive. Now, there are so many ways, so many areas which further research on this topic could illuminate. Like I mentioned earlier, some people with no ancestral ties to Ireland at all have become Irish language learners and speakers. One such person I interviewed identified as having Slavic ancestry with no Irish ancestry at all. She was an artist interested in Irish step dancing and singing, and she even incorporated elements of Irish folklore into her spiritual beliefs. It would be worth exploring what role non-dominant spiritual communities play in preserving the Irish language, because I thought that was very fascinating. It would also be worth further exploring the perceived gender imbalance in Irish language education in New York, like I mentioned earlier. And this could open up research into queerness in the Irish language, which I think is much needed. Queerness was discussed in our class only briefly, but the instructor did explain that the Irish language does in fact have words for queer identity terms like transgender, which kind of fits into the theme of Irish as a living modern language. But for now, I will wrap it up, and I thank you so much for watching this presentation. It's been a pleasure to share some of these experiences with you, and I very much look forward to digging deeper into the theoretical work of unpacking my findings. And finally, I would like to thank my advisors, Dr. Ayala Fader and Karina Hogan, as well as the Institute of Irish Studies for inviting me to present today. Take good care. Bye.